Hello and welcome to the Copper Link. This episode will be the first closer look at a single release, to look at how that release affected the metagame at the time. With all the night themes that we've had in the first cycle of 2nd edition, I wanted to highlight a release that really went all in on the night theme, and that was A Tourney of Swords. This was the first expansion in the Valyrian Block. A Tourney of Swords was released in late 2004. The state of the metagame at the time was that Valyrian Edition had been the latest release, and that coincided with the first rotation in the game. Valyrian Edition had introduced influence as an alternative economy, so players were still getting used to that, and the theme of the block was to make challenges matter more, which is why immunities were introduced. So the theme of A Tourney of Swords were knights, and that meant that all houses got lots of knights and lots of cards that synergized with the knight trait. All houses except Greyjoy, that is. They only have one knight, so their theme for the set was anti-knight tech. To start off, we should talk a little about how card cycles worked in the CCG. It was very common for the designers to come up with a certain mechanic for a card, and then they created one of each of those cards for each faction, and A Tourney of Swords had a lot of that, as you will see. First of all, let's look at the jumper characters. These were knight characters that you could put into play by using influence, and at the end of the phase they returned to your hand. The best jumper was arguably Stark's Knight of the Green Fork, who, if you played with a few attachments, could become pretty strong. Greyjoy's Sneaking Cutthroat was also very useful, though it was the most expensive one to trigger. Notice that it only had to participate in a challenge to get to discard a participating knight character when the challenge resolves. One theme that was introduced in A Tourney of Swords were challenge traits. These were traits that were given to a current challenge when certain conditions were met, and then you had other effects that only worked during a challenge with a specific trait. The challenge traits used in this set were Jousting Challenge and Melee Challenge. A Jousting Challenge meant that only one character could be declared as a defender, while a Melee Challenge required that 4 characters were participating in the current challenge. This leads us to the cycle of cards that perhaps had the biggest impact from the set, which were the Tourney Grounds. These were locations that helped you create jousting or melee challenges, and also had powerful effects for those challenges. Again, note that Greyjoy is the odd one out, but people who played first edition of the LCG will recognize that the effect of their Proving Grounds was the same as the Greyjoy agenda the old way. The Lannister Tourney Grounds was a huge card draw engine. Since the cards were revealed and put into hand, that meant that it got around the draw cap of 3 cards per round. But still, the Tourney Ground that had the biggest impact was Baratheon's Storm's End Tourney Grounds, since it created a whole new deck type, simply called Baratheon Joust. The key to the deck type, other than the Tourney Ground, was Marjories Favor, which gave you +1 strength, which is useful when jousting. It gave you 1 power for winning a joust, and also it let you stand your character. As a side note, the Favors was another cycle of cards that had some utility for each house. Especially Cersei's Favor was very good, since it gave both an intrigue icon, stealth, and most importantly, it prevented your opponent from playing nasty attachments on that character. Sansa's Favor was another good power grab card. If we go back to Baratheon's Joust deck, the way it usually worked was that you used Sir Davos Seaworth as your jouster, since he couldn't be killed. Then you attached Marjories Favor and also Lightbringer, that makes the jouster immune to events and character abilities. Now you have an 8 strength character that can't be touched or killed, and that grabs at least 2 power and stands every time it wins if you have your Tourney Grounds out. The final thing you would want is to give the character renown as well, and for that you had Marin Heat. This deck won a lot of tournaments worldwide, and even as other deck types became popular, Baratheon Joust still remained a solid tournament deck for many years. Speaking of Marin Heat, that was another card that was part of a cycle. Each house got their own warhorse. There was an attachment that could detach to become a character. As attachments, they often gave very useful buffs, and the utility of having an extra character to jump in meant that they were very efficient cards and saw a decent amount of play. There was also another Baratheon deck type that emerged from A Tourney of Swords, centered around the Knight of Flowers. For 2 influence, you would force your opponent to kneel a character they control, and if they knelt a character with lower strength than Flora's, then it would be discarded. This was a great engine for control as long as you had the influence for it. To support this deck type, it was often played using a new agenda released in A Tourney of Swords, which was Knights of the Realm. This let you draw 3 cards if you had the most knight characters in play, but you also only got to draw 1 card if your opponent had more knights. The deck also needed more knights, of course, and Baratheon had plenty of them to go around. Most notably, the Rainbow Guard characters that all had a different buff for all Baratheon lords, which of course the Knight of Flowers was. So Baratheon got a big boost from A Tourney of Swords, but the other houses were not left without help as well. For House Stark, the set provided some great support for their already existing House Tully deck. The deck was focused on the Blackfish, who let you attack with all of your House Tully characters at the same time, and then stand them all. As you might guess, this is very well suited for the melee challenge trait. With Winterfell Tourney Grounds, you could give the challenge the melee trait, and it also increased your claim by 1. Stark also got Blue Steel Dirk, which increased claim even more, and Sansa's Favor gave 2 power instead during melee challenges. And remember that both the Tourney Grounds and the Blue Steel Dirk were non-unique, so you could have more than one of them out. Lannister Tourney Grounds, as mentioned, was a huge card for House Lannister. But also, Sir Marin Heat became a staple in any Lannister deck for years to come. Anytime you lost an intrigue challenge, you had to discard an extra card from your hand. Greyjoy was the house that got the anti-knight tech in the set. Assassin of Pike was very useful as the set was released, and everyone was playing every knight that they could get their hands on. It was also a great pick in the A Tourney of Swords draft tournaments. Warrior of the Old Way is one of my favorite weenies of all time. Their ability was pretty much like Renown, but you got the power on the house card instead, and that's certainly not bad for a 2-cost character. House Targaryen didn't get that much help from A Tourney of Swords. They did get Killer of the Wounded though, which was a great card in burn decks. Also, Dragonborn Archer was an efficient weenie that was a precursor to the ambush keyword. House Martell was the newest house at this time. They had only been around for 1 expansion in the previous block and the base set in the current block, so they still had a lot fewer cards than the other houses. Since influence was still a new resource, it meant that some decks didn't bother using any influence at all, and Martell took advantage of that with Deadly Lover. Their utility diminished with time however, but at the time of release they did see a decent amount of play. Darkstar was a huge character for Martell. Just like Lannister Tourney Grounds, it was an effect that got around the draw cap, and Martell as a house didn't really mind losing challenges, especially considering cards like You Murdered Her Children, which is another card they got in this set. Character removal has always been good in this game, and removing all copies of that character could really mess up your opponent's deck if it relied too heavily on a single character. But more importantly, getting the chance to look through your opponent's hand and your opponent's deck to see what they play is a huge advantage, especially for a skilled player who knows how to take advantage of that information. Finally, I will mention a couple neutral cards that were impactful. The Red Keep was a very important card. It meant that you could use some of the most expensive influence effects much easier, and the immunity meant that the card would stick around much more easily. At the time, this became one of the most expensive AGOT cards on eBay. Tourney Magistrate was a card that perhaps wasn't as impactful as some of the other cards mentioned, but it was one of my favorites at least. Notice that Tourney Magistrate blanks the entire text box, including traits, which can be extra useful. I wouldn't mind if a card like this was reprinted in 2nd edition. So there you have A Tourney of Swords, an expansion that was full of flavor and deadliness. It saw House Baratheon get a huge boost, while some of the other houses didn't complain either. Some of the themes introduced in this expansion were still impactful almost 2 years later in Matt Lay's Lannister Knights of the Realm deck that won the 2006 World Championship. Until next time, this is the Copper Link.